November 7th, 1836. A deputy sheriff knocks on the door of a small blacksmith shop in Leicester, Vermont. Inside, a 32-year-old man, dirt under his nails, debts on his ledger, is placed under arrest. $78.76. That's what he owes. That's what might send him to prison. He bails himself out. He discovers a lien on his property. And before the sun sets, he makes a decision that will haunt him for years. He packs his tools, kisses his pregnant wife goodbye, and abandons 4 young children. He heads west with $73 in his pocket. Less than the debt. That's all he has. At the time, nobody in Vermont thought much of it. Another failed tradesman. Another man running from his creditors. But only because they had no idea who this bankrupt blacksmith would eventually become. Fast forward to today, and that man, John Deere, built the largest farm equipment manufacturer on Earth. A $158 billion empire, 73,000 employees, tractors on every continent. This is the story of how a fatherless boy who fled debtor's prison with nothing but his tools took a broken sawmill blade and changed the way humanity farms. John Deere was born on February 7, 1804, in Rutland, Vermont, above his father's tailor shop. He was the 3rd son in a family that was about to fall apart. Deere and Company, number 89 on the Fortune 500, $45.7 billion in annual revenue, a $158 billion market cap, 73,000 employees spread across 47 manufacturing locations worldwide, the largest farm equipment manufacturer on Earth. That green and yellow leaping deer, one of the most recognized corporate symbols in existence, stamped on tractors from Iowa to Indonesia. If you've ever driven past a farm, eaten bread, or worn cotton, you've touched something made possible by John Deere. But in 1836, John Deere was a bankrupt blacksmith running from the law. On November 7th of that year, a deputy sheriff in Leicester, Vermont, arrested him for an outstanding debt of $78.76. He bailed himself out. He discovered a lien on his property. And that same day, that very same day, he abandoned his pregnant wife, Demarius, and 4 young children. He fled west with $73.73 in his pocket. Less money than the debt that triggered his arrest. He was 32 years old. Debtor's prison was a real possibility if he stayed. This is the story of how a fatherless boy from Vermont, a man who lost everything twice before turning 30, took a broken sawmill blade and built a plow that broke the plains, and an empire worth $158 billion. John Deere was born on February 7, 1804, in Rutland, Vermont. In a small room above his father's tailor shop, he was the 3rd son in a family that was about to fall apart. His father, William Rinald Deere, was a merchant tailor who made fine clothes for Rutland's wealthier residents. His mother, Sarah Yates Deere, kept the household running. John was one of 6 children, the 5th born, the 3rd boy. But William was accumulating debts he could not pay. By 1808, the eldest son, 12-year-old William Jr., had already been apprenticed out to another family. That was the sign. The Deeres were sinking. Then came the vanishing. In 1808, when John was 4 years old, his father boarded a ship in Boston bound for England. William hoped to claim a family inheritance, enough to clear his debts and save his family from ruin. His last communication was a letter dated June 26, 1808, addressed to John's older brother. "I am now in expectation of embarking for England the first fair wind. I hope to obtain the means of paying my debts and making our family comfortable." Those were the last words William Rinald Deere ever sent. Family legend says he arrived in England, but was lost on the return voyage. No one knows for certain. What is certain is that John never saw his father again. He was 4 years old. His father was gone. Sarah Deere, not yet 30, was left alone with 5 children to feed. She worked as a seamstress on what sources describe as meager income. The family of 7 barely survived. Picture a 4-year-old boy waiting at the window of a Vermont house. His father promised to come back. He never did. But something in that hardship forged something in John. Those who knew him later described his unconquerable energy and determined will. He was blessed with strength capable of almost unlimited endurance. In his better days, he would stand at his anvil from 5 in the morning till 9 at night. As a young teenager, John secretly took a job grinding bark for Epaphras Miller, the local tanner, without telling his mother. He used the wages to buy himself shoes and clothes. The pair of shoes and suit of clothes he purchased were the first indications Sarah had of what her son had been doing. He was already learning to solve his own problems, and there was a moment, small, seemingly insignificant art, that would change everything decades later. Growing up, John occasionally visited his father's old tailor shop. He watched needles being polished and sharpened by running them through sand, making them smooth enough to glide through tough leather. Polished steel moves through resistant material. He filed that away. Years later, stuck in the Illinois mud, he would remember. John's formal education was limited. He attended district schools in Middlebury, Vermont, a schoolhouse with a long fireplace across the end of the room. The reading, writing, and arithmetic he obtained there before age 12 was, as one account put it, the principal educational start Mr. Deere had for life. But in 1821, at age 17, John and his mother made what sources call a momentous decision. He would learn a trade. He was apprenticed to one of Middlebury's most prosperous blacksmiths, a man named Captain Benjamin Lawrence. Captain Lawrence ran his shop on Mill Street in Frog Hollow, Middlebury. For 4 years, from 1821 to 1825, John learned to work iron. He earned $30 per year, plus room, board, and clothing. The shop was later excavated in 1975. The tools are now held by the Henry Sheldon Museum. Lawrence taught him how to forge ironwork for wagons, stagecoaches, and farm tools, but more than technique. He taught John what quality meant, how a well-made tool felt in the hand, how it performed in the field, how it lasted through seasons of hard use. John faithfully worked out his engagement of 4 years, and then he became a journeyman. What followed was a decade of movement. In 1825, he worked for William Wells and Ira Allen in Middlebury, building wagons, buggies, and stagecoaches. In 1826, he moved to Colchester Falls to work for Colonel Ozias Buell, handling all the ironwork for a sawmill and linseed oil mill. In 1827, he formed a partnership with John McVeigh in Vergen. In 1828, he worked at what was probably the Briggs shovel factory in Salisbury. Through it all, John developed a specialty. He became known across western Vermont for his highly polished tools, particularly hay forks and shovels that scoured themselves of the soil by reason of their smooth, satiny surface. Other blacksmiths made tools that worked. John Deere made tools that gleamed. He earned considerable fame for his careful workmanship and ingenuity. During his apprenticeship, John met a young woman at a neighborhood gathering in Middlebury. Her name was Demarius Lamb. She came from a somewhat well-to-do family. Her father, William Lamb, was a prosperous farmer in Hancock. She had attended Mrs. Emma Willard's School for Young Ladies. John waited to propose until he had established himself financially, working at Colchester Falls. They married on January the 28th, 1827, at her parents' home in Granville, Vermont. By 1829, John had saved enough to build his own shop in Leicester, a modest building, 25 by 35 feet. He was 25 years old. He wanted to be his own boss. Then came the fires. Twice in Leicester, between 1829 and 1831, John's shop burned to the ground. Twice he rebuilt. After the second fire, he borrowed money from Dr. Josiah Brooks and mortgaged everything to build again, this time in Hancock. He was already deep in debt, and the economy was sliding toward the panic of 1837. By 1836, John Deere had a wife, 4 children, a shop full of debts, and no way to pay them. Vermont's economy was collapsing. Farmers paid in bartered goods, not cash. There were plenty of other blacksmiths in the area competing for the same scarce work. And then, on November 7, 1836, a deputy sheriff knocked on his door, arrested $78.76, the sum that nearly ended everything. John bailed himself out. He discovered a lien on his property. He looked at his situation and made a calculation: stay and risk debtor's prison, or run and start over. That same day, he sold his shop to his father-in-law, William Lamb. He packed his blacksmith tools, and he said goodbye to his family. Demarius was 6 months pregnant with their 5th child. The 4 children, Francis, 8 years old, Jeanette, 6, Ellen, 4, and Francis Alma, just 2, watched their father leave. He carried his tools in a bundle on his back and had $73.73 in his pocket, less than the debt. That was what he had to show for 32 years of life. The journey took 3 weeks. Erie Canal to Buffalo, Great Lakes steamer to Chicago, overland wagon to a tiny settlement called Grand Detour, Illinois. Word had spread back in Vermont that Grand Detour needed a blacksmith. A fellow Vermonter named Leonard Andrus had founded the settlement in 1834-35 and had returned east to recruit settlers. Grand Detour had maybe 40 people, 13 buildings, and no blacksmith. John arrived in late 1836. Within 2 days, he had built a crude forge and was working. His first job was repairing Leonard Andrus's broken-down sawmill. The bankrupt runaway was back in business. By 1838, Deere had built a proper forge and an 18 by 24-foot house. He was surviving, but he was alone. Then, in the spring of 1838, a ferry crossed the Rock River, carrying a woman, 5 children, and 6 weeks of exhaustion. Demarius had made the journey west with their children and the William Peak family, William being Demarius's sister, Lucretia's husband. She stepped off that ferry, she walked toward John, and she handed him a baby he had never seen. His name was Charles Henry Deere, born after John fled, carried across a continent by his mother. Here, John, I carried him all the way from Vermont. That baby would save the company 50 years later. John Deere had his family back. He had a forge, he had work. But he also had a problem, the same problem every farmer in Illinois had: the soil. Midwestern prairie soil was unlike anything eastern farmers had ever encountered: rich, black, heavy, loamy, and impossibly sticky. They called it gumbo. The problem wasn't the soil's quality, it was some of the most fertile earth on the continent. The problem was what lay beneath it: native prairie grasses with deep, intertwined root systems extending 12 to 15 inches into the ground. John Muir would later describe it as a tough mass, chiefly formed by the cord-like roots of perennial grasses, reinforced by the taproots of oak and hickory bushes, some of which were more than a century old. Cast iron plows couldn't handle it. Cast iron had a rough, porous surface that gave sticky soil places to cling. Within feet of starting, the soil accumulated on the moldboard. Farmers carried wooden paddles to scrape the plow clean, stopping every few yards to chip away the black gumbo. One period writer put it bluntly: A cast iron plow will no more clear itself in most prairie soils than the edge of a chestnut rail drawn edgewise. The standard solution was a monster called the Prairie Breaker, a 125-pound behemoth requiring up to 7 oxen to pull, cutting no deeper than 2 inches. A farmer was lucky to plow 8 acres in an entire season. John heard the complaints constantly. Farmers said the same thing over and over. These prairies will never be farmed till we have a plow that scours. And John remembered. He remembered Vermont. He remembered his specialty, polished tools that shed soil. He remembered his father's tailor shop, needles polished smooth to glide through leather. In 1837, he found his material, a broken steel sawmill blade from Leonard Andrus's sawmill, an up-and-down Muley saw, cracked and useless. John Deere described what happened next in his own words. "I cut the teeth off the mill saw with a hand chisel, then cut a pattern out of paper for the mold board and share. I laid the pattern on the saw and cut out around it with a hand chisel, and with the help of a striker and sledge, I then laid the piece on the fire of the forge and heated it a little at a time, shaping it as best I could with the hand hammer." He bent the mold board over a log to achieve its curve. The share, the cutting edge, was steel. The mold board was smoothly ground wrought iron. Both surfaces were polished until they gleamed. Polished steel gives sticky soil no place to cling. The first customer was Lewis Crandall, a local Grand Detour farmer. John made his pitch. "Stranger, where do you live? Will you take one of these plows home with you and try it? And if it does not scour, will you let me know? I will send for it and get it without any cost to you." The farmer paused. "I? And if it does scour?" "I asked $10 for it." Crandall took the plow, and then came the moment. The polished steel cut cleanly through sticky black prairie soil. After years of farmers scraping wooden paddles against clogged iron, the soil simply slid off. The plow made a sound, a zing, a hum, as it moved through the earth. They called it the singing plow. Later, the plow that broke the plains. John broke with tradition. Most blacksmiths made items to order. You asked for a tool, they made it. John began manufacturing plows in advance, keeping inventory for customers to see and buy immediately. This was revolutionary for the trade. Production accelerated. In 1837, he made 1 plow. In 1838, 2 or 3. In 1839, 10. In 1840, 40. By 1843, 400. By 1846, roughly 1,000. To give you an idea how fast this was moving, he made 1 plow in 1837. 6 years later, he was making 400 a year, and he still couldn't keep up with demand. The 1838 plow was sold to a farmer named Joseph Brereton. In 1901, Charles Deere recovered it from Brereton's farm. In 1938, it was donated to the Smithsonian, where it remains today. By the mid-1840s, John Deere was no longer a bankrupt blacksmith. He was a manufacturer. He had a product people wanted, a family reunited, and a future. But success came with its own disasters. The partnership with Leonard Andrus, formalized in 1843, began to strain. They disagreed over expansion, over accounting, over the coming railroads, and where to position the business. In 1847, John made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He sold his interest and relocated to Moline, Illinois. Moline was a tiny settlement, 13 buildings, hardly more than Grand Detour had been when he arrived. But it sat on the Mississippi River. John was betting everything on water access, on the ability to ship steel in and plows out. He found new partners, Robert Tate and John Gould. Then came 1857. The Panic of 1857 hit American agriculture like a hammer. farm commodity prices collapsed. Farmers who owed money to Deere suddenly couldn't pay. And John, operating without limited liability protections, faced personal bankruptcy. Again, 20 years after fleeing Vermont, he was staring at the same nightmare. The save came from an unlikely source. His 21-year-old son, Charles, the baby Demarius had carried across a continent, went to banker John Gould and secured an emergency loan using accounts receivable as collateral. Charles saved the company. He was barely old enough to vote, but the setbacks kept coming. In 1866, a company called Candy, Swan and Company set up shop in Moline. They produced nearly identical plows with nearly identical catalogs. Charles Deere sued for trademark infringement. He lost. A former employee testified that nearly every one of Deere's own innovations had been borrowed in some way from others. The trademark hadn't been officially registered. The court ruled against them. The forced response: redesign the logo, rename the company. In 1869, Moline Plough Works became Deere and Company. The iconic leaping deer was born from defeat. And through all of this, the business failures, the lawsuits, the financial near-death experiences, John was burying his children. 4 of his 9 children died before he did. Hiram Alvin, dead as a toddler in 1844. Francis Alma, dead at 16 or 17 in 1851. Mary Frances, dead as an infant in 1852. And Francis Albert, the eldest son, the one John had groomed for succession, the heir apparent, dead at 20 in 1848. The same year John had planned to bring him into the business. Then, in 1865, after 38 years of marriage, Demarius Lamb Deere died. The woman who had waited in Vermont while he fled. The woman who had carried his baby across a continent. The woman who had rebuilt a life with him in Illinois. John Deere buried 4 of his children and the wife who had stood by him through bankruptcy, fire, flight, and fortune. He was 61 years old. He kept building. He handed operational control to his surviving son, Charles. He remarried to Demarius's younger sister, Lucenia Lamb. In May 1866, he served as mayor of Moline from 1873 to 1875. He never stopped improving the plough. They haven't got to take what we make, and somebody else will beat us, and we will lose our trade. That was his answer to tragedy. Keep making, keep improving, never stop. The early years had been defined by a single problem: getting steel. In 1843, John arranged imported steel from Naylor and Company of Sheffield, England. Shipments took 6 months and cost $300 per ton. The wait was excruciating. The expense was crippling. Then came 1846. Jones and Quigg Steel Works in Pittsburgh shipped something that had never existed before: the first slab of cast plow steel ever rolled in the United States. It was rolled by a man named William Woods, and it was shipped directly to John Deere. American steel, cheaper, faster, better. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. In 1855, Deere produced over 10,000 plows. 65 workers filled the Moline factory. By 1857, they were making 13,400 implements across 9 different plow models. By 1874, 50,000 plows. In 1837, John Deere made 1 plow. Less than 20 years later, he was making 10,000 a year. By 1874, 50,000. The blacksmith who fled Vermont with $73 was running the largest plow factory in America. The product line expanded. In 1863, Deere introduced the Hawkeye riding cultivator, the first riding farm equipment, advertised as usable by a one-arm or one-legged man. In 1875 came the Gilpin Sulky plow, nicknamed the king of the riding plows. It could plow 3 acres in 12 hours. In 1878, the Gilpin won the grand medal at the Paris Universal Exposition. But the real transformation came from Charles Henry Deere. The baby who arrived on that ferry in 1838 became the company's true business architect. He joined at 16 as a bookkeeper. By 21, he was effectively running the company while his father focused on manufacturing. Charles created the branch house system, wholesale sales offices in Kansas City, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Council Bluffs, and San Francisco. He expanded the product line to over 300 models by the time of his death. He navigated the panic of 1857, the crisis of 1873, and the trademark disaster of 1866. John built the plow. Charles built the empire. In 1868, the company incorporated as Deere and Company. The original stockholders, John Deere, Charles Deere, Stephen H. Velli, John's son-in-law, and George Vinton. The family business was now structured to outlast its founder. The logo, that leaping deer, was first used in 1873. John reportedly designed it himself, along with a friend. It was registered as a trademark in 1876. The green and yellow colors followed in the late 1870s and 1880s. Today, it's one of the most recognized corporate symbols on Earth. John Deere had done what his own father never could. He had paid his debts. He had made his family comfortable. He had built something that would last. But the blacksmith from Vermont was getting old. John Deere remained company president in title until April 1886. He died on May 17, 1886, at Red Cliff, his 3-story home overlooking Moline. He was 82 years old. More than 4,000 people attended his funeral. He was buried at Riverside Cemetery in Moline, the very cemetery created during his term as mayor. The bankrupt runaway had become a pillar of the community he helped build. I will never put my name on a product that does not have in it the best that is in me. That was his creed. It is a source of consolation to me to know that I never willfully wronged any man and that I never put on the market a poorly made implement. That was his legacy. Charles Deere led the company until his death in 1907. William Butterworth, Charles's son-in-law, succeeded him and led the company into tractors. In 1918, Deere acquired the Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company and entered the tractor market. The company has been led by Deere family descendants or in-laws continuously into the modern era. Today, Deere & Company is number 89 on the Fortune 500, a position it has held every year since 1955, $45.7 billion in revenue, $158 billion market cap, 73,000 employees, the world's largest farm equipment manufacturer. The headquarters remain in Moline, Illinois. The slogan, "Nothing runs like a Deere," was created in 1971 by a copywriter named Bob Wright. Management initially rejected it. It was literally retrieved from a trash can. Now it's iconic. In 1836, a bankrupt blacksmith fled Vermont with $73 in his pocket, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 4 children. He was running from debtor's prison. He had nothing but his tools and his skill. Today, Deere & Company is worth $158 billion, the largest farm equipment manufacturer on Earth. And it all started with a broken saw blade, a forge, and a man who remembered how polished needles slid through leather. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this story of the man behind the machine, make sure to subscribe. And until the next one.